so much for joining us. Let me ask you, first of all, clearly this is a problem. People are feeling it in their pockets in the UK. Where does the answer lie?
Well, I think the answer has to lie in protecting the lowest paid, the most vulnerable, who are going to suffer the greatest from this huge, unprecedented rise in inflation, which is clearly not being compensated by rises in pay. So the focus for policy, I think, has to be on guaranteeing people have enough money to heat their homes, to feed themselves properly, to get to work, the basics essentially. And the focus then needs to be on reducing inflation by, I think, taxing the better off, taking money out of the economy and demand out of the economy from those firms, for example, the big energy companies, but also larger firms across the piece who have actually seen very large increases in their profits since the pandemic, to reduce prices. So far, we haven't seen much evidence of that type of strategy. Instead, we're depending on the Bank of England to ramp up interest rates, which I don't think is going to work.
Why is it not going to work? What are the downsides of raising interest rates to combat inflation?
So raising interest rates essentially means across the economy, people are hit with a higher cost of debt. Now, the people with the most debt, again, tend to be lower income people. We've seen huge increases, for example, in consumer debt in the last month as people struggle to meet their everyday costs. People in the UK have high mortgages, although many are on fixed term, they'll be coming up for renewal soon. So we need to avoid hitting the poorest. We need to focus attention on the better off. And the causes of this inflation, of course, in the medium term, can only be dealt with by decarbonising our economy and making ourselves less dependent on energy imported from overseas. So to deal with that, you need investment in insulating our homes, in renewable energy creation, and that requires upfront investment. And again, I think it requires speeding up the energy transition, again, by trying to push firms away from further investment in fossil fuel activity and shifting towards renewable energy.
Do you think there's an issue here with the reasons behind inflation rising in the UK?
I think that there's the Bank of England's made some statements to suggest that they're worried about a wage price spiral, that if prices rise and we put up people's wages, public sector wages, that will make inflation worse. But there's no evidence of this wage price spiral. What there is evidence of, perhaps, is a profit price spiral, where especially some of the larger firms are using these higher costs to ramp up their prices and price gouging. And that's where the state needs to step in to tax those companies more, so they don't raise their prices so much, and try and take that type of demand out of the economy. There's no evidence at all of a wage price spiral, as your programme stated. We've had the biggest fall in real wages in 20 years over the last few months.
Okay, Josh, stay with us. I want to bring in the panel now to discuss this further. Let me ask you first of all, Peter. I mean, this is going to be hard, isn't it, on what is ostensibly a new generation who are now facing high inflation and, falling wages?
Yes, it's been a generation, really, since British people have known high inflation. I'm afraid I'm old enough to have lived through the high inflation of the 1970s and the 1980s, and it can be a very toxic political mix. High inflation, low growth, and an increasing cost of living squeeze has real consequences for people, and it often leads to strikes. We're already seeing strikes breaking out across the British economy. That is only likely to get worse when we get the massive hike in energy prices feeding through later in the year. And at this time of really acute difficulty, Josh has been saying what we need are higher taxes. Actually, the leadership candidates in the Conservative Party race are bidding for lowering taxes to try to attract the votes from their Conservative Party members. And at a time when we ought to be planning and making contingency plans for this really difficult crunch that is coming in the UK in the coming months, the government is basically on holiday. It's on drift, waiting for a new leader. No great contingency planning is being done. So while President Biden is introducing massive packages in the US, really in the UK, we're on care and maintenance. And I think that is stoking up some very difficult problems for the new leader.
Josh, do you agree with that?
Yeah, entirely. I mean, I think there's a sort of misunderstanding of the role of tax in the UK. We sort of think that we need to reduce taxes to free the economy to grow. But at a time of high inflation, if you just get rid of corporation tax, there's no evidence that the companies actually invest more. More like they're just going to create bigger profits and pay their shareholders more. So what you actually need to do is sort of strategic approach to tax, where you direct the economy towards an energy transition. And the Biden Inflation Reduction Act is a great example, actually, of how to push through a major platform of increased spending on decarbonisation and green energy, whilst also introducing higher taxes on the wealthy and higher income groups to try and keep a lid on inflation. So that's actually quite a nice example from across the water for UK politicians to look at.
Marianne, let me bring you in on this, because of course inflation is a global issue and an issue also in the United States.
It is, but every country has dealt with it differently, and you've seen the different results. And I think Josh and Peter just made the point. The contrast between the approach of the United States and Britain tells the story. Right now in the United States, inflation's 8.525%. Now, that's not great, but Britain's expected to have an inflation rate of 11% this fall. And many independent analysts point to Boris Johnson's signature policy of Brexit for exacerbating it. And at the same time, he's on holiday, to everyone's point, not addressing it. Here in the United States, it has been a painful gas and clutch balance, where we've raised interest rates, but certainly made investments. And I think the transition to clean energy is an important one. And you've seen that just in the past hour as President Biden signing that important legislation, which will create clean energy jobs in America, American-based, to get everyone to transition. And when you do that, you're also reducing not only pollution, but you're reducing people's utility bills. So there have been many, many steps taken, also on the tax side, trying to give tax relief to the middle class, not the tippy top 1% who always seems to get all the tax breaks, but for the everyday workers who are really suffering the most with increased costs, stagnant wages. So there's a way to do this, and I think you see the difference between the United States and Britain here, and especially when you look at the fact that Britain has the slowest economic growth in the G20, but for Russia. So there is a policy and an approach to do this, and I think the United States on this one has it right.
Okay, Marianne, thanks for that. And Josh Ryan Collins, thank you. Well, as we've been just speaking about, it's been a long time coming and took a lot of tough negotiation with senators in his own party, but President Joe Biden has finally signed into law his sweeping $750 billion health